Recently, I've been doing some research about the topic of anti-nutrients. It's a big and complex topic, but there's one subject that's really caught my eye, and it's this phytochemical called lectins. Historically, there's been documented cases of intoxication that's been caused by over-consuming lectins in the form of white kidney beans, a food that's prevalent in a lot of cultures, cuisines, dishes, and households. And so my first thought was, if so many people are being exposed to this chemical called lectins, and it can cause overdosing or intoxication, then that should be an area of concern, right? So my first question was, what are lectins and how can we avoid eating too much of it? And then if you do eat too much of it, what are the signs and symptoms of overdosing on lectins? So in 1980, lectins were designated by Goldstein et al. As glycoproteins of non-immune origin, showing two or more binding sites able to reversibly interact with carbohydrates, precipitate glycoconjugates, and agglutinate animal or plant cells.
What?
So basically, that just means that lectins are a chemical that consists of a sugar chain and amino acid chains. And what this does is it allows for a stable molecule to resist degradation, and the amino acids allow the chemical to have specific amino acid sequencing that allows it to bind to specific cell types. So these cell type bindings occur in any type of living and even non-living cells. And the cool thing about this is that lectins can be used in this way for pharmaceutical therapeutics. As of 2020, there's been over 500 different types of lectins that have been isolated from plants and have been studied for their applications and their specific binding uses. In current pharmaceutical studies, they're using these lectins they call it decorating the nanoparticles of prescription drugs, which just means that inside of a capsule that you would take for oral drugs, they're using lectins and attaching them to nanoparticles that serve as the therapeutic agent. The cool thing about the lectins is that you can stick a bunch of them onto these nanoparticles so that they'll have a higher affinity for binding to specific cells. Not only can they bind to specific ligands on cells, but they have a tendency to trigger either endocytosis or transcytosis through things like the M cells in the Peyer's patches of your gastrointestinal tract. These lectins, not only can they serve as ligands or affinity agents for cells, but they can also have their own cellular cascading effects aside from just binding. There's these things called ribosome inactivating lectins. What these RILs do, the lectins themselves can bind to specific cells. Typically, they're used for defective cells. And when they bind to these cells, other ligands inside the cytoplasm of the cell will bring that ligand into it, have a cascading effect, and inactivate ribosomes, which are basically protein factories inside of the cells, and it will trigger things like apoptosis and have other cells commit phagocytosis like monocytes, and they'll engulf these defective cells and destroy them. So you can think of the applications of this being very useful in cancer studies and trying to solve things like HIV and influenza virus and things that have been genetically modified by viral activity. We've actually seen these types of lectins being used in clinical trials, and they're showing actual efficacy. And lectins, they're not only derived from plants themselves, but they can be made in plants, but they're also made in all the living organisms. We just use them from plants because it's easier to isolate chemicals from plants because they're not moving around, they're not, having problems. Different tissues of plants develop different types of lectins. The tissues, you can think of a plant as being like seeds, heartwood, stems, leaves, fruits, roots, tubers, bulbs, rhizomes. Each of these different types of tissues from a plant will have different types of lectins that elicit different reactions. In clinical studies, lectins are being used in vaccines, they're being used in targeting insulin for hyperglycemia, targeting specific peptides and proteins and DNA, helping out with inflammatory bowel disease, also in cancer therapy. But all those cool things aside, initially when lectins were being elucidated in the UK back in 1976 to 1989, there were 50 reported cases of intoxication caused by raw white kidney beans. What happened was these white kidney beans causing these people to have real serious problems after 1 to 3 hours of consuming them. They decided that it was because of these lectins. They call them PHAs. The lectins, they termed it as being in agglutinin, and agglutinin is basically just meaning that the lectins cause things to stick together. They're adhesives. The lectins themselves in these white kidney beans, they term them as being hemagglutinins. So hema meaning as relating to erythrocytes or red blood cells. And so these lectins, when eaten in the form of raw white kidney beans, because the beans are raw and they're not cooked, they have a higher content of these lectins, and lectins are permeable in the gastrointestinal tract and they will end up in your bloodstream. That's why they're being used and looked at as being good oral pharmaceutical agents. But aside from that, these lectins, these hemagglutinins, they found that after consuming some white kidney beans raw, the lectins have such a high affinity and such a specific binding mechanism to red blood cells that it would cause the red blood cells in the bloodstream to clump up and restrict blood flow. And these people were starting to get hospitalized, and that's how the reports were done. It was seen as a big problem. And then you started getting people starting to fearmonger the idea of eating plants because of their lectin content. This stems not only to just the specific phytochemicals of lectins, which are not really specific because there's, like, as I said, over 500 elucidated specific lectin chemicals, but there's fearmongers in the nutrition and food community that are saying don't eat plants because they have lectins, or don't eat plants because they have phytoestrogens, or they have beta-syssterol, or they have starch, they have fiber, they got polyunsaturated fats. And they say these terms because they can use this to cause the public to look at a food and become scared of it, and then they use the development of fear to sell their own plan. This is really popular in the carnivore scene, and there's this guy named Saldino. Like, there's this one big popular clip of him saying don't eat oatmeal because it has phytic acids, another chemical. And it's like, okay, I'm so scared. It's like, no, don't be scared. In the terms of white kidney beans, have you ever eaten white kidney beans and gotten sick because of it? No. And it's because if you prepare the foods and you cook them, it gets rid of that kind of content. Who in the world is gonna eat raw white kidney beans? That's weird. So if you're concerned about it, which you probably should be, don't eat raw white kidney beans. There's ways to get rid of reduce the lectin content so that you can enjoy all the other nutrients that are in the white kidney beans. Just think, how do you normally prepare beans? You soak them and you cook them. That makes them safe. You soak them, you boil them, you autoclave them, which just means like high pressure steam. So like a pressure cooker can also get rid of the lectin content by fermenting them and germinating them. You can look at it in the early days, lectins were seen as a problem, but if you just take a step back and look at the situation and think, how is it a problem and how can we apply that to other scenarios to have a better outcome, then you start thinking outside the box and you can say lectins are really cool and they're probably going to be used in the future for medicinal research. Don't be afraid of them. If you're eating beans, it's like a whole amino acid profile, it's a complete protein. You got fiber, you got good carbs, you got minerals, you got magnesium, zinc, iron, a little bit of copper, I think, bunch of stuff, bunch of phytochemicals, bunch of good stuff that's going to be happening if you're eating beans. And then on top of that, there's already a lot of human studies that show that eating foods that are highly diverse in your diet and eating things like beans is good in reducing inflammation and leveling out your biomarkers and being in a generally healthy state. So eating beans is good. And then there's going to be someone that probably sees this and thinks, oh, well, I saw a study about lectin consumption and it being correlated with cases of inflammatory bowel disease. That's just like a proposed theory, and it's not really, they don't really know the mechanisms behind it. And also they don't really have any good data showing that that's the case in isolating lectin content itself and showing that it causes people to have higher rates of inflammatory bowel disease. Unfortunately, rats and animals, they have a little bit of a different gastrointestinal tract than we do. So it's kind of hard to say, I got this result in a rat, so therefore this will apply to all humans. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. I wish it did. That would be pretty cool. But You know, it just doesn't. So also, if you're worried about, people are saying lectins, if you eat a bunch over time, because they're resistant to degradation, they're gonna end up accumulating in your gastrointestinal tract, similar to the theory of this one Indian dude who said it takes like 4 or a bunch of years to digest protein powder.
Protein shakes are really bad.
Like, can you elaborate?
It takes 3 years to digest 1 scoop of protein shake, by the way. It stays in your body.
Your gastrointestinal tract, the enterocytes, or the cell lining of your gastrointestinal tract that absorbs nutrients, that stuff turns over every 3 to 5 days. And if you're eating fiber, that stuff just basically goes in there and scrapes out all the cells. And then that's why your enterocytes have to turn over so much and proliferate and create new ones. And it's not only that, but they get exposed to a bunch of stuff because people are freaking eating paint and eating boogers and freaking swallowing Elmer's glue. Your gastrointestinal tract is pretty secure. It's got like barriers, like it's got a big pocket of acid that denatures and kills a lot of bacteria and their harmful proteins. Your gastrointestinal tract, it's pretty selective in what it brings in. So a lot of stuff just passes through you. You don't gotta be like super worried about it. I'm basically just saying lectins are cool. You're probably gonna be hearing about it in 20 years. If you don't hear about it, just know that it might be in the pills or the oral drugs that you're taking for certain conditions. Maybe you learned something. I don't know. I just was reading this stuff and thought it was cool and wanted to talk about it. So just remember, cook your beans, don't eat them raw. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, comment, and like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.